This recording brought to you by the University of Adelaide.
It's a pleasure to be here today, back in Adelaide. I've been a frequent visitor over the last few weeks and months, and indeed I lived here on two separate occasions for probably a total of about 12 years, and enjoyed my time here. That means something. It doesn't mean a lot. I've been lucky. I've enjoyed most of my the various places I've lived as my jobs have changed and my career has progressed, and I've been lucky that I've had a family that's moved with me. So in terms of them enjoying Adelaide, they did on both occasions. Our twins were born in Adelaide, and we do indeed think of Adelaide very fondly. So it's always good to come back. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, because one of the things that I think is part of my present job was always a part of my various jobs, Vice-Chancellor at ANU, at Flinders, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor indeed as a young academic, because my first stint in Adelaide was a young academic at the what was then new Flinders Medical School. As I recall, I came back to Adelaide from overseas in the second year of the enrolments in that particular program. And it was an enlightening experience in a way, because my previous 6 years had been at Oxford, where everything is done, very largely done in the way that it was done a long time ago. And a lot of the ways in which it was done were very good. But at Flinders, with a brand new curriculum, when I arrived, we were already tossed into the maelstrom of redesigning the curriculum for the next stage of the development of the medical school. And you learn a lot from being part of a process of change. We all know that change is inevitable. We all know that we need to change, and that, and indeed that in order to survive, let alone prosper, we must change. And being part of change teaches you an enormous amount, and especially when you're young, because you're looking from the bottom end of the tree up towards the top, and you're seeing how circumstances, how institutions and organisations can change, and indeed how many people want to resist change, because there are not lots of people. There are a number of people, I won't say lots, of people who actually like to keep things the way they are. And whilst that can be quite frustrating from time to time, and as a young person you can feel that you're pushing the proverbial uphill with a one-tine fork, nevertheless you learn a lot from that process, and you see a lot about what is worth preserving from the past, because not everything new is good, not every change is well designed necessarily, and certainly what used to be is not always bad. So one of the lessons you learn is that you should always be seeking to preserve what was good, and you should be seeking to change for the better, whatever it is that you want to change. And I think we're at a time now in Australia where we've got to reflect on that. And what I plan to do through this is to drop in little bits and pieces as I talk to you about some of the things that I think are impacting on us right now, both as a nation generally, but also in particular how we are facing a serious set of challenges, and a lot of the talents and skills that will be developed in you as PhD students will be essential for the future prosperity, but prosperity in the full sense. I don't just mean economic prosperity, I mean social, cultural, I mean healthy. I mean a country, a place, a world, indeed, that we would like to live in, and be proud of having contributed to. So it's important work that you do as PhD students, and don't let anybody ever tell you that it isn't. Even if they don't understand necessarily what you are doing or why you are doing it, it's important work that you do. And it has an intrinsic value, and part of that value is the understanding that comes from the work that you do. And one of the really important things for us as researchers and us as scientists, and although I haven't done an experiment for 25 years, if I'm generous to myself, 27 years if I'm more honest, a long time ago, the point about it is that you learn as you go through that the intrinsic value of understanding things and understanding things better. And there are people around who say that all knowledge is useless unless it can be applied. But when you get under the surface of a statement like that, it doesn't have legs. It doesn't have legs because to apply something, you've got to know it. So you've got to do the work that leads to the understanding, that leads to the knowledge, that leads to a capacity or an opportunity to use and to apply if that's the most appropriate thing to do with the knowledge that you're doing. So there is an intrinsic value in doing research because we want to know something that we presently don't know, or we want to understand something better than we presently understand it, or indeed with some PhDs and some research that will get done in the University of Adelaide and every other university in Australia for that matter, which is very much at the applied end, and it's very important that that be done too. But what you do is that you make a contribution to our understanding in your chosen field at a time in your lives when the field is open to you, and that the questions can loom large, the questions can loom very interestingly, because as well as knowing what you know, you also know what you don't know and what isn't known about your field. And it's important to recognise what you do and what you have to, and what you don't know and what you need to do to get there. And if you do that, then you play your part in securing the sort of future that we'd like for this country and that we would like to make as our contribution to the world. We have a situation at the moment in our world where a great many of the problems that confront humanity are global problems. Of course, there are problems, Australian problems, that confront Australians, and it's important that we have people who work on those. But it's also important to remember that a lot of the big problems have no respect for national boundaries. They have no respect for national cultures. Bird flu doesn't care where you live or what you look like or how you live. You'll get it if it's going to get you. There are things like the climate and climate change which will have an impact on you wherever you live, and whatever you think of it, it's going to happen. And so some of the ways in which we can resolve those problems, or we can get answers to those problems, or even solutions sometimes, but certainly the ways in which we can mitigate and manage those problems, we will be able to actually make a contribution to the betterment of humankind through research, through science and through the research that you do. And I think it's always important, and I know it's harder when you're focused on a PhD, and as I've said before, I can really remember what it's like to know that there's a deadline out there that you have to meet, and it's got to be written in a way that intelligent lay people can understand, like us, well, not them, me, today. I know all of that. But it's also important to remember that it makes a contribution to the world in a way that's critically important to the future of the world and not just ourselves. As I said, there's research across the whole spectrum that's represented here today, from the most basic of research, as we still probably inappropriately call it, through to the applied. And I think that's good, and it's particularly important at the moment that we acknowledge that it occurs and that it can still be of high quality. Because there is, and there are, reports around to governments which would indicate that we should be focusing much more on some part of the research spectrum than other parts. And I think we need to be alert to the fact that the whole spectrum of research is good, and that in this country, and with students from whichever countries come here to join us to do their research, that we are willing to do research that covers that whole full and broad spectrum of research. But this is a time when basic research is questioned, As I said, there was a proposition not so long ago that some of the money that's presently spent on basic research should be taken and used to support applied research. The government hasn't responded to that yet, but the whole issue, I think, is fundamentally flawed, or the approach is fundamentally flawed, or at least can be seriously questioned. Not because I don't think that we need applied research, because I think we do, but as I've said before, we do what we do now because we know that there is a need to understand something better. And as I have also said before, that innovation really means knowing something today that we didn't know yesterday. And there is a whole movement at the moment to try to get much more bang for the buck from research. What is the investment leading to? What are we getting from it? And it is a very substantial amount of government investment in it. And that's true. And I do think we have an obligation to give value for that investment. But a lot of that investment is, as I said right at the very beginning, understanding something, and in particular when we think about the need to innovate and the need for innovation in this country. And it's true to say that we aren't particularly good at it. But in order to be innovative, we need to know something today that we didn't know yesterday. And I think that's a fair description of discovery, and I think it's a substantial contribution to the description of basic research. So we're always searching, we're always wanting to know why. Why is something as it is? How did we get to be what we are and where we are, and how we survive where we are and what we are? And we're always looking for examples to illustrate that there are very good reasons in order to sometimes to support research in areas that would appear to be quite esoteric, quite idiosyncratic indeed, and the interests of a very small number of people. And right now there's a good one floating around, and I thought I'd share it with you because it highlights the point, I think, very clearly. And that's what some people would call bird watching. There is a report that comes out of Europe that talks about how much money was spent by research councils and agencies in Europe on research, within which was bird watching. Now, bird watching connotes a certain sort of person, I think. You have instantly in your mind the sort of person who might be what we would call a bird watcher, and they study where birds go and where they migrate from and where they nest and how they mate and when they appear and when they disappear and all those sorts of things. But the important thing to remember was that when bird flu came along, all of a sudden, all of that work suddenly took on extreme significance, and extreme significance in terms of the application of that knowledge to understand the migratory patterns of birds, the nesting habits of birds, the mating habits of birds of all descriptions. And so what appeared to be esoteric, idiosyncratic hobby pursuits of bird watching suddenly had profound significance for population health. And the supporters of the need to do work to understand and the need to encourage people to do work that is seeking understanding grab hold of examples like that and say, sure, you need to apply knowledge, but you need to have the knowledge first in order to be able to apply it. And so we need to make sure that we support in Australia that whole spectrum of research. There is virtue in having a PhD. I've got one, your judges have got one, many of the people in the audience have got one, and you'll have one soon too. And I don't think that you should underestimate the virtue of having a PhD, but what I'd like you to remember and to use is always reflect on the process by which you got to a PhD. And I think one of the things that we neglect in this country is the value of the scientific process and the scientific method. We do not take it seriously enough, and we tend to neglect it even as scientists. So the Australian Council of Science Deans told me 6 months ago they were going to do a survey of science graduates 10 years after they graduated, and they were going to ask them how important was science to them in their job, whatever their job happened to be. And there are a couple of good figures that came out of it. One was that only 40% of the science graduates were still working in a field 10 years after graduation that they would label as directly related to science. But something like 99% of them said that the process that they went through to get that education was important in their job, whatever their job happened to be right now. And it was interesting because when the deans told me, they said they were going to ask these science graduates how valuable their science training was for them in whatever job it was that they had. And my reaction was, well, first you will have to tell them that they were trained, because in universities we tend to take it for granted. We tend to let content dominate the educational part of the process, but in fact the content is a vehicle by which we are delivering a process. And it's one that encourages you to think about evidence, to use evidence, to accumulate, to analyse, to argue, to be sceptical, to not take things at face value. Because scientists know that you can do another experiment and it might well change what you're thinking or how you're thinking about the particular topic. So we don't take evidence as a given, we take evidence as an argument that you can use, or an element that you can use to mount an argument about conclusions that you might want to draw from the evidence that is available until more evidence becomes available. And it's the process that's really important. It's important in a PhD. As I've said many times, when I finished my DPhil, I knew more about the active centre of one enzyme than anybody else in the world, for a whole week, until somebody else published a paper on it that took it in a different direction or a step further than I'd taken it. And it was really important to me, and I felt really great about it, and my thesis still sits on my bookshelves. I haven't opened it for 35 years, but I can remember most of what's in it still, because for me it was an achievement to set myself the task of getting a PhD in a particular time frame on a particular topic, and to survive, as we had in that university in those days, oral exams. So I had to get dressed up in good clothes and go and face two examiners who could have me for an hour or a day if they wanted to ask me questions about the work that I'd done. And it was a good thing to do, and it was a good thing to have done. But what endures is not the knowledge that I presented when I produced my PhD. What endures for me is the fact that I went through a process rigorously, and I understand how science works in a way that I can still apply to my present job and to all of my previous jobs, that you look for the evidence, you analyse the evidence, you question the evidence, you ask whether it's fair or not, or reasonable or not, or whether the present interpretations of it are reasonable or not. And you go through a process that lets you draw a conclusion. And as a scientist, you're always willing to say that when I see more evidence, I might change what I'm thinking about this particular thing. And it's the big advantage of an education in science, and it's the icing on the cake is the PhD, because it gets you to focus on an issue or a problem at considerable depth. But the same process still applies no matter how deeply it is you go into that. And I think that's important for you, because I think that what that enables you to do is not to think overly narrowly about career options that are available to you when you complete your degree. And I think it is important that you remember that. Let me just give you a couple of figures. Australia had, when it was last measured, 8 doctorate qualified people per 1,000 in the workforce. 8. Switzerland has 28. Germany has 20. The US has about 11. So there are countries that we would compare and contrast ourselves with who have many more doctorates per 1,000 in the workforce than we have in Australia, and we're at the low end. When you ask people what their job is by function, then Australia says that it has somewhere around about 9 researchers per 1,000 in the workforce, and that too is at the very low end. And when you look at where our researchers are concentrated, they're concentrated in higher education. Around about 80% of Australia's researchers are in higher education, about 10 or so % in other research agencies, and obviously therefore smaller numbers elsewhere in other sectors in the workforce. But the skills that you have as a PhD graduate can take you anywhere. The skills of analysis and debate and argument and all the things that I said before about evidence apply and are useful in many sectors of the workforce, yet we've tended to prepare people who believe that the option they've got is to take the job of their supervisor. That's why I keep moving, because there's a whole string of PhD graduates there who have been after my job for the last 35 years, and the only way that I can keep them at bay is to keep moving. But that's what we've done in our universities, and I think that I would urge you as PhD students and graduates to think about what the options are and how the skills and talents that you're developing as you prosecute your PhD projects, how they're preparing you not just for one career path and option, but for more than one. One of the things we have to do, of course, in this country is to urge employers to see the value in the skills and talents that you are acquiring and refining as you go through your course. It is fair to say that both in the university sector and in the broader employment sector, there is a lot of cross-talking past each other. That employers would say, oh, well, you know, they're too narrowly qualified, that they specialise, they're over-specialised. But it's not so much the content and the knowledge content that you have, although of course that will be important in some career options available to you, but it's also all of those other skills that you have that you can apply, which we need to make sure employers recognise and value. And as I ask them from time to time when I meet them, as I do now on a fairly regular basis, what do these other countries know that we don't? Why is it that we in Australia can happily get by and say, well, 8 per thousand is good enough for us, when in other countries that outperform us by all the research metrics like Switzerland or Sweden, they outperform us substantially, have got researchers throughout their workforce and not just confined very largely to one sector. So I think that Australia will be prosperous when the knowledge and the talents and skills that people acquire as they go through a science education, and particularly a PhD, when they're able and when they do permeate more widely, and that we can create a culture in our workforce in Australia where learning is seen to be an important part of it, where analysis is seen to be a critical part of it, where evidence is the fundamental basis on which we move sectors of our workforce, not whim, not belief, not thinking about any old rubbish, evidence, and the analysis and understanding of what that evidence actually means and how it can be used. So, for you PhD students, I wish you well. I'm sure you'll all complete your degree in minimum amount of time, and your theses will be amongst the bestsellers on the bookshelves of Paper Chain and all of that. And I don't want to disappoint you to say that they won't be, but they will be just as important as some of the volumes that are on those shelves of those bookshops. And never forget that, and never forget the contributions that your talents and skills will be able to make to the future prosperity of this country, whatever country it is that you come from and that you go back to apply those talents and skills, and consequently to the world as a whole. So thank you very much.